The rain that fell on London that April morning would be nothing compared to the storm about to break over the Westfall family England, 1825. The April rain fell steadily against the grimy windows of the Westfall townhouse in Bloomsbury, a once respectable address that now bore the unmistakable marks of genteel poverty. The wallpaper, once a fashionable cream and gold damask, had faded to a sickly yellow in patches where the afternoon sun had beaten against it year after year. The carpets showed threadbare paths where generations of feet had walked, and the furniture, though still serviceable, bore the dull sheen of pieces that had been polished too many times, with too little proper wax. Miss Lydia Westfall stood at the window of the morning room, her slender fingers pressed against the cold glass as she watched the rain create rivulets down the pane. At 26, she had long since abandoned the hope of a brilliant match, or indeed any match at all. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman whose beauty was of the quiet, unassuming variety that society often overlooked in favour of more dramatic features. Her hair, a soft shade of light brown with hints of gold that caught the weak afternoon light, was arranged simply at the nape of her neck. Her eyes, a clear green that reminded some of new spring leaves, held an intelligence and wariness born of watching her family's fortune crumble piece by piece over the past 5 years. She wore a morning dress of pale grey muslin, not because it was fashionable, but because the fabric had been turned and remade so many times that the original colour had long since faded to something that could pass for mourning in dim light. There was no money for new gowns, no money for anything beyond the barest necessities. Even the modest household staff had been reduced to a cook, a maid of all work, and Molly, the young woman who served as Lydia's lady's maid, though she performed a dozen other tasks as well. "Miss Lydia," Molly's voice came from the doorway, soft with concern. "Your father requests your presence in his study, and there is a visitor." Lydia turned from the window, her heart sinking at the anxiety in the young woman's tone. Molly had been with the family since she was 14, now 22, and possessed an uncanny ability to sense trouble before it fully materialized. "Who has called?" Lydia asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Lord Winters, miss," Molly confirmed, her plain features tightening with distaste. "He arrived 1/4 ago and has been closeted with the master since." Lord Percival Winters. The name alone was enough to make Lydia's stomach clench with apprehension. He was their primary creditor, the man who held mortgages on what little remained of the Westfall property, and whose increasingly frequent visits carried with them an air of menace barely disguised beneath a veneer of gentlemanly concern. Lydia smoothed her skirts and straightened her spine. Whatever news Winters brought, she would face it with the dignity her position required, even if that position was rapidly approaching destitution. The study, once her grandfather's pride with its floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and massive oak desk, now felt oppressive and close. Her father, Viscount Edmund Westfall, sat behind the desk looking a decade older than his 58 years. His face, once handsome and open, had grown haggard and grey, his shoulders perpetually hunched as though bearing a physical weight. Across from him sat Lord Winters, a portly man of middle years whose expensive clothing and abundant jewellery spoke of prosperity built on others' misfortunes. His thinning grey hair was carefully arranged to disguise its sparseness, and his brown eyes held a calculating gleam that Lydia had learned to recognise and fear. "Ah, Miss Westfall!" Winters rose with exaggerated courtesy, his gaze moving over her in a manner that made her skin crawl. "How delightful to see you looking so well, despite the unfortunate circumstances that bring me here today." "Lord Winters," Lydia acknowledged, with the smallest curtsy propriety allowed. "Father, you wish to see me." The Viscount gestured weakly to a chair. "Sit down, Lydia. Lord Winters and I have been discussing matters of business, and there are certain realities we must face." Lydia sat, folding her hands in her lap to conceal their trembling. She had heard this tone before, had seen this particular shade of desperation in her father's eyes during countless previous conversations about their declining fortune. Winters resumed his seat, settling back with the satisfaction of a cat who had cornered a mouse. "Your father and I have been reviewing his obligations to me, Miss Westfall. The debts are considerable, I'm afraid, and the time for generous extensions has passed. Without immediate payment, I will be forced to call in the mortgages and pursue legal remedies for the outstanding sums. How much time do we have? Lydia asked quietly, though she directed the question to her father rather than their tormentor. 6 weeks, the Viscount said, his voice barely above a whisper. At most, 6 weeks, Winters confirmed, to produce £3,000 or to make alternative arrangements that might satisfy the debt. His gaze fixed on Lydia again, lingering in a way that made the meaning behind his words unmistakable. Alternative arrangements, Lydia repeated slowly, understanding flooding through her with cold certainty. You speak of more than financial matters, Lord Winters. A smile touched his fleshy lips. I speak of practical solutions to mutual problems, Miss Westfall. Your family requires relief from crushing debt. I require, shall we say, connections to the nobility that money alone cannot purchase, despite my considerable wealth. You presume much, sir, Lydia said, her voice steady, despite the fury building in her chest. I presume nothing, Winters replied smoothly. I merely observe that advantageous marriages have solved similar difficulties for countless families throughout history. My son Harold is in need of a wife of good breeding. You are in need of financial security. The arrangement would benefit all parties. Lydia, her father began, but she cut him off with a sharp look. I must decline Lord Winters' generous interest, she said, investing the word generous with enough irony to make her meaning clear. I'm certain there are many young ladies who would be delighted by such an opportunity. Winters' expression hardened. Few young ladies of 26 with no dowry and declining prospects can afford such pride, Miss Westfall. I suggest you consider the matter carefully. Your father's health is not what it once was, and the strain of debtor's prison would surely prove fatal. The threat hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Lydia's fingers tightened in her lap, nails biting into her palms, but she kept her face composed. You have my answer, Lord Winters. If you will excuse me, I have matters to attend to. She rose and left the study before either man could respond, walking with measured steps until she reached the privacy of her own small chamber on the second floor. Only then did she allow herself to lean against the closed door, her breath coming in sharp gasps as the full weight of their situation crashed over her. £3,000. They might as well have owed £3 million for all the hope they had of raising such a sum. Her father's investments in shipping ventures had failed spectacularly when 2 ships were lost in storms off the African coast. The small estate in Hertfordshire that should have provided steady income had been poorly managed during her grandfather's final illness, and what remained barely covered its own expenses. Even her mother's jewels had been sold, piece by piece, until nothing remained but her wedding band and a single strand of pearls too modest to fetch enough to matter. And now, Winters offered marriage to his son as the price of their continued existence. Harold Winters, whom Lydia had encountered precisely twice at social gatherings and found thoroughly repellent. A man of 24 who carried himself with the arrogance of inherited wealth and none of the grace that should accompany good breeding. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Miss Lydia, Molly's voice came through the door. I've brought tea. Lydia opened the door to find the young woman bearing a tray with the household's chipped but serviceable teapot and a single cup. Molly's hazel eyes were troubled as she entered and set the tray on the small table by the window. I couldn't help but overhear some of the conversation, miss, Molly said quietly as she poured the tea. Lord Winters has a terrible reputation below stairs. The servants in his household, they talk. Lydia accepted the cup gratefully, wrapping her cold hands around its warmth. What do they say? Molly hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. That his son Harold is worse than the father, miss. That he's been involved in several scandals hushed up with money. That there were serving girls who left their positions suddenly, with generous payments to ensure their silence. The tea turned bitter on Lydia's tongue. She had suspected as much from Harold's manner, the way his eyes had followed younger women at the assemblies with a predatory interest that made her skin crawl. Thank you for telling me, Molly, she said quietly, though it only confirms what I already believed. I will not marry Harold Winters, whatever the cost. But miss, what will you do if your father cannot pay? I don't know, Lydia admitted, setting down the cup before her shaking hands could spill its contents. But there must be some alternative. Perhaps my Aunt Lady Pembroke. She's travelling on the continent still, isn't she, miss? Last letter said she'd be gone through summer at least. Lydia nodded slowly. Her mother's elder sister had offered to take Lydia in several years ago, but pride had prevented the Viscount from accepting what he viewed as charity. Now, with Lady Pembroke months away in Italy, and unreachable by any communication that might bring timely help, that avenue offered no immediate relief. The following evening brought the Haverford Ball, one of the season's more anticipated events. Lydia would have preferred to remain home, but her mother insisted that maintaining appearances was essential, even if it meant wearing the same emerald silk gown she had worn to a dozen previous gatherings. At least the colour complemented her eyes, and the style remained classical enough to avoid looking obviously outdated. The Haverford ballroom glittered with candlelight from 3 massive chandeliers, their crystal drops casting rainbow fragments across the assembled company. The scent of hothouse flowers mingled with expensive perfumes and the underlying warmth of too many bodies in close quarters. Lydia stood near a marble column, partially concealed in a way that had become habitual over the years. From this vantage point, she could observe without being observed, could watch the dancers and the social manoeuvring without being expected to participate. The younger debutantes swirled past in their pale muslins and silks, fresh-faced and eager, their eyes bright with hope and calculation as they evaluated potential partners. Lydia remembered being one of them, 8 years ago, though it felt like a lifetime. She had been pretty then, if not beautiful, and her father's fortune had still been intact enough to attract moderate interest. But no offers had materialized before the money began to disappear, and with each passing season, her value on the marriage market had steadily declined. "Miss Westfall!" A familiar voice made her turn sharply. Lord Winters stood beside her, having approached with the stealth of a serpent. "How unexpected to see you here, and looking so well in that charming gown." "Lord Winters," she replied coolly, refusing to acknowledge the barb about the gown she knew he had seen before. "Have you given more thought to our conversation yesterday?" he asked, moving closer than propriety strictly allowed. "Harold was most disappointed to learn of your initial reluctance." "My answer remains unchanged," Lydia said, fighting the urge to step back and reveal how much his proximity unsettled her. "Such pride," Winters observed, his tone suggesting he found it both amusing and foolish. "I wonder if you'll maintain it when your father is imprisoned for his debts, when your mother is turned out of her home with nothing, when you yourself are forced to seek employment as a governess or companion. If anyone will have you without references, I'm willing to provide." "Odi." The threat was delivered in a conversational tone that made it all the more chilling. Before Lydia could formulate a response, a commotion near the refreshment table drew their attention. A young lady had gestured too enthusiastically while holding a glass of champagne, and the contents had arced through the air in a glittering spray directly toward Lydia. She had no time to move, bracing herself for the cold shock and inevitable ruin of her only presentable gown. But the champagne never reached her. A tall figure had interposed himself between Lydia and the cascade, and the liquid splashed harmlessly across the back of his evening coat instead. "My profound apologies," the gentleman said, turning to address the horrified young lady who had caused the accident. "The fault is entirely mine for standing in such an awkward position." Lydia found herself looking up into a pair of startlingly blue eyes, set in a face of classical masculine beauty. The gentleman was tall, easily over 6 feet, with dark brown hair that showed a tendency to wave despite being ruthlessly styled. His features were strong and angular, his jaw firm, his nose straight. But it was his eyes that held her attention, intelligent and penetrating, holding a depth of character that suggested more than mere aristocratic breeding. "Are you quite all right, miss?" he asked, those remarkable eyes now focused on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Yes, thank you," Lydia managed, suddenly very conscious of her faded gown and modest appearance compared to the obvious quality of his attire. "Though I fear your coat has suffered for your gallantry." A slight smile touched his lips. "Coats can be cleaned. Gowns are often less forgiving of champagne stains, particularly emerald silk." "You're very observant, sir." "When the subject warrants close observation," he replied, and there was something in his tone that made heat rise in her cheeks. "Sebastian," another gentleman approached, clapping their benefactor on the shoulder. "There you are. Lady Haverford has been seeking you this past half hour. Then I had best not keep her waiting," the dark-haired gentleman said, but his eyes remained on Lydia for a moment longer. "I hope the remainder of your evening proves less eventful, Miss Westfall," she supplied. "Miss Lydia Westfall." "Miss Westfall," he repeated, as though committing the name to memory. Then, with a bow that managed to be both proper and somehow intimate, he departed, leaving Lydia staring after him with uncharacteristic confusion. "Do you know who that was?" Molly, who had been hovering nearby in her capacity as chaperone, whispered urgently. "He said his name was Sebastian," Lydia replied, still watching the gentleman's tall figure as he navigated the crowded ballroom with easy confidence. "That's the Duke of Greymont, miss," Molly breathed. "Sebastian Morland, one of the richest and most powerful men in England. They say he's refused every match offered to him for the past 10 years. A duke. Lydia felt foolish for not recognizing the quiet authority in his bearing, the deference with which other guests had made way for him. And he had sacrificed his evening coat to save her gown, had spoken to her with a warmth that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. She turned back to find Lord Winters watching her with an expression that sent ice through her veins. He had witnessed the entire exchange, had seen the way the Duke looked at her, and his features had twisted into something ugly with calculation and jealousy. "How interesting," Winters said softly. "Perhaps you aim higher than my son after all, Miss Westfall. Though I should warn you that dukes do not marry penniless viscounts' daughters, particularly those approaching spinsterhood. They take mistresses of that class, nothing more." The crude insult struck like a physical blow, but Lydia refused to give him the satisfaction of a visible reaction. "Your mind runs in predictably vulgar channels, Lord Winters. If you will excuse me, I find I require some air." She walked away with her head high, feeling his malevolent gaze following her across the ballroom. The evening that had begun so dismally had taken an unexpected turn, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. The morning after, the ball brought a letter delivered by a footman in unfamiliar livery. Lydia accepted it from Molly with trembling fingers, recognizing Lord Winters's heavy seal on the expensive parchment. "Shall I stay, miss?" Molly asked quietly. "Please," Lydia said, breaking the seal and unfolding the single sheet. The letter was brief and devastatingly clear. Lord Winters requested her presence that afternoon at his residence in Mayfair to discuss a proposal of marriage from his son Harold. The invitation was phrased courteously, but the underlying command was unmistakable. She was expected to attend, to listen, and, the letter strongly implied, to accept. That evening's dinner was a sombre affair. Lady Margaret Westfall, whose beauty had faded along with the family fortune into a kind of pinched anxiety, pushed food around her plate without eating. The Viscount stared into his wineglass as though seeking answers in its depths. "We must discuss Lord Winter's proposal," Lady Margaret finally said, her voice tight with stress. "Lydia, you cannot simply dismiss it out of hand." "Can I not?" Lydia replied, setting down her fork with careful precision. "Am I to sell myself to the highest bidder like a horse at Tattersall's?" "Don't be crude," her mother snapped. "This is about survival, about keeping a roof over our heads and avoiding scandal. It's about saving your pride," Lydia shot back, years of resentment finally breaking through her careful control. "About maintaining your position in society regardless of the cost to me." "Lydia," her father said wearily, "your mother is right. We have no other options. Then perhaps it's time to accept that we've lost everything," Lydia said, standing abruptly. "That we should retire to the country, live quietly on what remains, and stop pretending to a status we can no longer afford." "And do what?" Lady Margaret demanded. "Tend chickens? Take in sewing? Your father is a viscount. We have responsibilities, a position to maintain." "A position bought with my happiness," Lydia said quietly. "Forgive me if I find that price too high." She left the dining room before either parent could respond, climbing the stairs to her chamber, where she locked the door and finally allowed the tears to fall. Over the following days, Lydia tasked Molly with a delicate mission. The young woman had contacts throughout London's servant networks, and those networks knew everything that happened in the great houses. If Harold Winters had a reputation, the servants would know the truth of it. What Molly discovered confirmed Lydia's worst fears. Harold Winters had been involved in at least 3 scandals involving women, all hushed up with generous payments and threats. 2 serving girls had left their positions suddenly with enough money to disappear into the countryside. A young widow of gentle birth had refused his advances at a house party and found herself the subject of vicious rumours until she was forced to leave London entirely. The pattern was clear and horrifying. Harold Winters took what he wanted and destroyed anyone who resisted, secure in the knowledge that his father's wealth could buy silence and erase consequences. On the 5th evening after Winters' letter, Lydia confronted her parents in the drawing room. The fire had burned low, and shadows gathered in the corners as she stood before them with Molly's findings clutched in her hand. "I will not marry Harold Winters," she said with quiet finality. "I have learned things about his character that make such a union impossible. He is violent, cruel, and dangerous to women. If you force me to this marriage, you condemn me to a life of fear and degradation." The Viscount's face crumpled. "Lydia, we have no choice." "There is always a choice," she replied. "You may choose to value my safety over your pride. You may choose to accept that our circumstances have changed and that clinging to the trappings of nobility will destroy us all." "And what would you have us do?" Lady Margaret asked, her voice sharp with fear and anger. "Become paupers? Live in some cottage while society laughs at our downfall? Better that than sell your daughter to a monster," Lydia said. She turned to her father. "I will find employment. I will support myself. But I will not marry Harold Winters. Not to save this house. Not to preserve your status. Not for any reason you can offer." She left them sitting in silence, her heart pounding with the enormity of her defiance. Tomorrow she would write to Lord Winters with her formal refusal. The consequences would be severe, but anything was preferable to the fate he offered. As she prepared for bed, Lydia found herself thinking of blue eyes and a kind smile, of a duke who had sacrificed his coat to save her gown. It was foolishness, she knew. Winters had been right about one thing: dukes did not marry penniless viscounts' daughters. But for just a moment, as sleep claimed her, she allowed herself to imagine a different life, a different future. One where impossible things might somehow become possible. The morning sun cast weak rays through the study window as Lydia sealed the letter with trembling fingers. The wax, plain and unadorned unlike the elaborate seals used by families with remaining pretensions to grandeur, bore only the simple Westfall crest. Inside, her refusal of Harold Winters' proposal was phrased with all the courtesy she could muster, but the meaning was unmistakable. "Are you certain, miss?" Molly asked quietly from where she stood by the door. "Once this is sent, there's no taking it back." "I'm certain," Lydia replied, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Please have this delivered to Lord Winters' residence immediately." The young woman took the letter with obvious reluctance, her plain features tight with worry. "I'll see it done, miss, though I fear what may come of it." "So do I," Lydia admitted softly. "So do I." The response arrived with shocking speed, delivered by one of Winters' footmen before noon had struck. Lydia recognized the heavy parchment and elaborate seal, her stomach clenching as she broke the wax and unfolded the single sheet. The words were a masterpiece of barely veiled threats, wrapped in the language of gentlemanly concern. Lord Winters expressed his profound disappointment at her decision, noting that such foolish pride often preceded devastating falls. He reminded her, with poisonous courtesy, that the mortgages on the Westfall properties would be called in within the month unless alternative arrangements were made. He suggested, with false solicitude, that her father's fragile health might not survive the strain of legal proceedings and public disgrace. The letter concluded with an invitation to reconsider, extended for a period of precisely 6 weeks, after which all offers of assistance would be permanently withdrawn. Lydia's hands shook as she read the final paragraph, where Winters made his position brutally clear. He had influence with potential employers throughout London. He had connections in legal circles. He had the means to ensure that the Westfall family's ruin was both complete and public. Unless, of course, Miss Westfall came to her senses and recognized the generous nature of his son's interest. "Miss Lydia?" Her mother's voice came from the doorway, sharp with anxiety. "What is that letter? Is it from Lord Winters?" "Yes," Lydia said quietly, folding the parchment before her mother could read its contents. "He has responded to my refusal." Lady Margaret's face paled. "What have you done?" "Lydia, how could you refuse without consulting your father and me?" "I consulted my own conscience," Lydia replied, rising from her chair. "That must be sufficient." "Sufficient?" Her mother's voice rose to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. "Nothing is sufficient but survival, you foolish girl. Do you not understand what will happen to us?" The commotion brought the Viscount from his chamber, where he had been resting on doctor's orders. His face was grey, his breathing laboured as he gripped the doorframe for support. "What is this shouting?" he demanded, though his voice lacked its former authority. "Margaret, what has happened?" "Your daughter has doomed us all," Lady Margaret said, her hands twisting together in agitation. "She has refused Lord Winter's proposal, and now he threatens to call in the mortgages immediately." The Viscount's face went from grey to white, then to an alarming shade of red. He pressed one hand to his chest, his breath coming in short, painful gasps. "Edmund!" Lady Margaret rushed to his side as he staggered, nearly falling. "Lydia, fetch the doctor. Quickly!" Lydia stood frozen for one horrible moment, watching her father struggle for breath, before training overcame shock and she ran for the door. "Molly!" she shouted down the stairs. "Molly, send for Dr. Harrison immediately. Tell him it's urgent." The next hours passed in a blur of fear and guilt. Dr. Harrison, a stern man of middle years who had attended the family for decades, examined the Viscount with grave efficiency. When he emerged from the bedchamber, his expression told the story before his words did. "Your father has suffered an episode of the heart," he said, addressing both Lydia and her mother in the drawing room. "His condition is serious. He requires complete rest, freedom from any form of agitation or distress. Another such episode could prove fatal. Will he recover?" Lady Margaret asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "If he rests completely and avoids any source of anxiety, he may improve," Dr. Harrison replied. "But I cannot stress enough the importance of keeping him calm. No business matters, no financial discussions, no distressing news of any kind. His heart simply cannot bear the strain." After the doctor departed, Lady Margaret turned to Lydia with an expression of cold fury. "This is your doing," she said, each word precise and cutting. "Your stubborn pride has brought your father to the edge of death." "Mother, do not speak," Lady Margaret cut her off. "You have made your choice, and now we all must live with the consequences. If your father dies, his blood will be on your hands." Lydia fled to her chamber, the weight of her mother's words crushing the breath from her lungs. She had known her refusal would have consequences, but she had not imagined this. Her father's grey face, his laboured breathing, the doctor's grave expression, all played over and over in her mind like a terrible performance. She sank onto her narrow bed, pressing her hands to her face as tears finally came. Was her mother right? Had her pride and her principles brought them to this desperate point? Should she have simply accepted Harold Winters and his father's terms, sacrificing herself to save her family? But even as the thoughts tormented her, she remembered Molly's findings, the serving girls who had disappeared, the widow driven from London by rumours, Harold Winters' reputation for violence and cruelty toward women. Could she have married such a man? Could she have placed herself in his power, knowing what she knew? A soft knock at the door preceded Molly's entrance. The young woman carried a tray with tea and what looked like toast, though Lydia had no appetite. "You need to eat something, miss," Molly said gently, setting the tray on the small table. "Starving yourself won't help anyone." "How can I eat when my father lies ill because of my actions?" Lydia asked, her voice rough with tears. "Your father lies ill because of Lord Winter's wickedness and years of poor financial decisions," Molly corrected firmly. "Don't let them make you believe this is your fault, miss. You've done nothing but refuse to sacrifice yourself to a monster. But if he dies, then he dies because his heart was weak, not because you chose to save yourself from a terrible fate," Molly interrupted. "Miss Lydia, I've served this family since I was a girl. I've watched you give up everything for them. Your prospects, Your happiness, your very life has been spent trying to shore up their crumbling fortune. You owe them love and respect, but you don't owe them your destruction." The fierce loyalty in the young woman's voice brought fresh tears to Lydia's eyes. "Thank you, Molly," she whispered. "I don't know what I would do without you." Across London, in the elegant study of Greymont House in Mayfair, Sebastian Morland, Duke of Greymont, sat behind his mahogany desk reviewing correspondence with an unusual lack of concentration. His mind kept returning to a pair of intelligent green eyes and a quiet dignity that had struck him more forcefully than any debutante's calculated charm. Miss Lydia Westfall. The name repeated itself in his thoughts with persistent regularity. There had been something in her bearing, in the way she had thanked him for his intervention with genuine gratitude unmarred by simpering calculation, that had captured his attention completely. "Your Grace," his secretary, Mr. Thomas Bradshaw, entered with his customary efficiency. "The reports you requested on the shipping investments have arrived." "Thank you, Bradshaw," Sebastian said, accepting the papers. Then, seemingly on impulse, he added, "What do you know of Viscount Westfall?" Bradshaw's eyebrows rose slightly, his only indication of surprise. "The Viscount of Bloomsbury, Your Grace." "Very little, I'm afraid. The family has fallen on difficult times in recent years. Poor investments, I believe, and mounting debts." "Find out more," Sebastian said, unable to fully explain even to himself why he felt compelled to investigate. "Discreetly, I want to know the full extent of their financial difficulties and who holds their debts." "Of course, Your Grace. Shall I prepare a summary for you?" "Please, by tomorrow, if possible." When Bradshaw departed, Sebastian leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. He had spent 10 years avoiding the matrimonial ambitions of every ambitious mama in London, had perfected the art of polite disinterest that discouraged even the most determined pursuit. Yet one brief conversation with a woman who expected nothing from him had accomplished what years of calculated attempts had failed to achieve. She had made him want to know more, to understand the intelligence behind those green eyes, to discover what thoughts occupied a mind clearly capable of holding its own in conversation. The report Bradshaw delivered the following afternoon was illuminating and disturbing. Viscount Westfall owed approximately £3,000 to various creditors, with Lord Percival Winters holding the majority of the debt. Winters had a reputation, Bradshaw noted carefully, for lending money to struggling nobility and then extracting advantageous marriages or property in lieu of repayment. Several families had been ruined by his schemes, their daughters married off to his associates, or his own son, Harold, a young man whose reputation among the servants' networks was decidedly unsavoury. Sebastian read the report twice, his jaw tightening with each pass. So that was Winter's game. He had manoeuvred the Westfall family into a position where they had no choice but to accept his terms, likely including a marriage between Miss Westfall and his disreputable son. The thought of that intelligent, dignified woman being forced into such a union made something cold and hard settle in Sebastian's chest. He had seen too many lives destroyed by men like Winters, had watched his own mother suffer under his father's cruel indifference until her heart simply gave out from the strain. He would not stand by and watch another woman be sacrificed to preserve masculine pride and social position. "Bradshaw," he called, making a decision that would have seemed reckless if it hadn't felt so entirely necessary. "Send an invitation to Viscount Westfall. I wish to discuss a potential business venture with him. Make it clear that the matter is purely exploratory, nothing that would obligate him in any way." "When shall I suggest for this meeting, Your Grace?" "Tomorrow afternoon, at his residence, not here. I want to see their situation firsthand." The following day found Sebastian's elegant carriage pulling up before the Westfall townhouse in Bloomsbury. The neighbourhood, while respectable, showed signs of gentle decline. The houses here belonged to the lower ranks of nobility and the wealthier merchant class, families of comfortable but not extravagant means. The interior of the Westfall home confirmed what the report had suggested. Everything was clean and well maintained, but the furniture was old, the carpets worn, the overall impression one of genteel poverty carefully disguised. The butler who showed him to the drawing room had the stiff manner of a senior servant maintaining dignity in a declining household. "Your Grace," Viscount Westfall rose from his chair with obvious effort. The man looked a decade older than his years, his face grey and drawn. "You honour us with your visit." "Not at all," Sebastian replied, noting the tremor in the older man's hand. "I hope I'm not intruding at an inconvenient time." No, please be seated." The Viscount gestured to a chair. "My secretary mentioned you wished to discuss business matters?" Before Sebastian could respond, the door opened and Lady Westfall entered, followed by Miss Lydia Westfall herself. Sebastian rose immediately, his gaze drawn to Lydia, despite proper etiquette requiring him to acknowledge her mother first. She looked even lovelier than he remembered, though there were shadows beneath her eyes that suggested sleepless nights. Her day dress of simple blue muslin was well made but clearly not new, and she wore it with unconscious grace that made the modest garment seem elegant. "Your Grace," Lady Westfall curtsied. "What an unexpected pleasure. May I present my daughter, Miss Lydia Westfall, though I believe you may have met at the Haverford ball." "Indeed we did," Sebastian said, bowing to Lydia. "Miss Westfall, a pleasure to see you again. I trust your gown survived its near encounter with champagne." "Thanks entirely to your intervention, Your Grace," Lydia replied, and he was pleased to see a faint smile touch her lips. "Though I fear your coat may not have been so fortunate. A small price for preventing a catastrophe," he said, holding her gaze for a moment longer than strict propriety allowed. The conversation that followed was carefully casual, Sebastian discussing a fictitious shipping venture he claimed to be considering and seeking the Viscount's opinion on various routes and investments. It was pure invention, but it served its purpose, allowing him to assess the family's situation while establishing himself as a friendly presence rather than another vulture circling their misfortune. What impressed him most was Miss Westfall's contributions to the discussion. When her father struggled to recall specific details about trade routes or tariff regulations, she supplied the information smoothly, revealing a knowledge of commerce that would have been impressive in a man and was extraordinary in a woman. She spoke of literature and politics with equal facility, and her observations were sharp, insightful, untainted by the simpering agreement that passed for conversation among so many women of her class. "You're remarkably well read, Miss Westfall," Sebastian observed during a discussion of recent parliamentary debates. "Do you keep current with political matters?" "When circumstances allow," she replied, "though I confess my sources are limited to newspapers and whatever books we can acquire from the lending library." "The lending library," he repeated thoughtfully. "I would be happy to grant you access to my own library at Greymont House. The collection is extensive, and I find it shameful to keep such resources sequestered when they might benefit minds capable of appreciating them." Colour rose in her cheeks. "That's very generous, Your Grace, but I couldn't possibly—" "Please," he interrupted gently, "consider it a favour to me. Books are meant to be read, not merely displayed. You would be doing me a service by ensuring they receive proper attention." Before she could protest further, Lady Westfall interjected. "How kind of you, Your Grace. Lydia does love to read, though we've had to economise in recent months." The reminder of their financial straits hung awkwardly in the air, and Sebastian smoothly redirected the conversation. When he took his leave an hour later, he had accomplished his primary objective, establishing himself as a potential friend and ally rather than a stranger, and confirming that Miss Lydia Westfall was everything he had suspected and more. The following week brought new complications. Winters, true to his threat, sent legal representatives to the Westfall residence demanding immediate payment or agreement to alternative arrangements. The phrase was ominous in its vagueness, but everyone understood its meaning. Lydia, watching from the landing as the men departed, felt the walls closing in around her. 6 weeks. They had 6 weeks to produce an impossible sum or face complete ruin. She spent the next 2 days making discreet inquiries about positions as a governess or companion. Her education was solid, her manner refined, and several families had shown interest until they requested references. Then, invariably, the interest cooled and disappeared. It took Molly's investigation to discover that Winters had quietly spread word through his network that Miss Westfall was unreliable, proud, and likely to cause disruption in any household that employed her. The systematic destruction of even her meagre prospects was devastating. Winters had blocked every avenue of escape, ensuring that she had no choice but to submit to his terms. It was then that Sebastian's invitation arrived. Would the Westfall family do him the honour of visiting his country estate in Surrey for a small gathering? The invitation included assurances that the journey would be made comfortable and that the visit would place no financial burden on his guests. Lady Westfall was beside herself with excitement. A duke inviting us to his estate! Lydia, this could change everything. You must make the most favourable impression possible. But Lydia, staring at the elegant script of the invitation, felt only a confusing mixture of hope and fear. Why would the Duke of Greymont take such interest in their family? What did he truly want? And how could she dare to hope that his attention might offer a way out of the trap that was closing around them? The journey to Greymont Estate took the better part of a morning in early May, the Westfall family travelling in a carriage Sebastian had thoughtfully sent to spare them the expense. The countryside unfolded in shades of green as they left London behind, and despite her anxiety about the visit's true purpose, Lydia found herself appreciating the beauty of the rolling Surrey hills. Greymont itself took her breath away. The pale stone manor rose from manicured grounds like something from a painting, its classical proportions speaking of wealth accumulated over generations rather than recently acquired. The approach led through an avenue of ancient oaks whose branches formed a cathedral ceiling overhead, dappling the carriage with shifting patterns of light and shadow. Magnificent! Lady Westfall breathed, her eyes gleaming with calculations Lydia preferred not to consider. Sebastian met them at the entrance, his informal country attire of dark riding coat and buckskin breeches, somehow making him appear even more attractive than his formal evening dress had. His smile of welcome seemed genuine as he handed Lydia down from the carriage, his touch lingering on her gloved hand for a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Miss Westfall, I'm delighted you accepted my invitation," he said, those remarkable blue eyes fixed on her face. "I hope the journey wasn't too taxing." "Not at all, Your Grace," she replied. "Your carriage is exceptionally comfortable." The interior of the house matched its exterior's promise. Unlike the Westfall townhouse with its air of faded gentility, Greymont spoke of carefully maintained prosperity. The furnishings were elegant without being ostentatious, the artwork clearly valuable but displayed with taste rather than showmanship. It was the home of a man secure enough in his position that he felt no need to prove it. After the Viscount and Lady Westfall were shown to their chambers to rest from the journey, Sebastian offered to show Lydia the library. She accepted eagerly, her love of books overcoming her natural caution about being alone with him. The library exceeded anything she had imagined. 2 stories of books lined the walls, accessible by a graceful spiral staircase. Large windows flooded the space with natural light, and comfortable chairs were arranged near the fireplace in invitation. The scent of leather bindings and old paper filled the air like incense in a temple dedicated to knowledge. "Oh," Lydia breathed, turning slowly to take it all in. "This is extraordinary." "I'm glad you appreciate it," Sebastian said, watching her with obvious pleasure. "My grandfather began the collection, and I've continued adding to it. Please feel free to explore. Anything that interests you is yours to borrow." For the next hour they wandered among the shelves, discussing literature and philosophy, with an ease that surprised them both. Sebastian was impressed by the breadth of Lydia's reading, despite her limited resources. She was startled by his willingness to listen to her opinions without the patronizing dismissal she had come to expect from men. "You've read Burke's writings on the French situation?" he asked, as they paused near a section of political philosophy. "Yes, though I found his conclusions rather alarmist," Lydia replied. "He viewed revolution as purely destructive, but surely there must be circumstances where existing structures are so corrupt that dramatic change becomes necessary." "A dangerous sentiment," Sebastian observed, though his tone held approval rather than censure. "Many would consider such thoughts inappropriate for a young lady. Many would consider reading itself inappropriate for young ladies beyond novels and poetry," Lydia countered. "I've found that the opinions of many are often designed to keep women ignorant and compliant." His laugh was genuine and delighted. "Miss Westfall, you are remarkable." The conversation shifted to their circumstances almost naturally, Lydia finding herself speaking more freely than she had intended about her family's situation. She explained her father's poor investments, the mounting debts, the pressure from creditors. though she carefully avoided mentioning Winters by name or the specific nature of his demands. "It's difficult," she admitted, gazing out the library window at the peaceful grounds. "Watching my parents struggle, knowing that our position becomes more precarious each day. My father's health suffers from the strain, and my mother grows more anxious and bitter." "What would help?" Sebastian asked quietly. "If you could change one thing about your circumstances, what would it be?" "Freedom from the debts," Lydia said immediately. "If we could pay what we owe, we could live modestly but comfortably on what remains. My father could recover his health without the constant anxiety. We could find peace, even if we had to give up our pretensions to social prominence." "And if someone offered to help, to provide the funds needed to clear those debts?" Lydia turned to face him, her expression carefully controlled. "That would depend on what such a person expected in return. Generosity is rarely without strings, Your Grace." "True," he acknowledged. "But suppose the terms were reasonable. A simple loan at fair interest, with repayments scheduled according to your family's ability." "I would say that such an offer sounds too good to be true," Lydia replied, "and that my father's pride would likely prevent him from accepting what he would view as charity, regardless of how reasonably it was structured." The truth of this prediction became evident that evening when Sebastian broached the subject with the Viscount over dinner. The offer was everything Lydia had described: fair terms, reasonable interest, repayment schedules that took into account the family's limited means. It was, in fact, extraordinarily generous. "I cannot accept," the Viscount said, his face flushing with a mixture of shame and stubborn pride. "You're very kind, Your Grace, but I cannot place my family further in debt, even to so generous a creditor." "It wouldn't be further debt, sir," Sebastian pressed. "It would be consolidation under terms you can manage, rather than facing demands you cannot meet." "The answer is no," the Viscount said with surprising firmness. "I appreciate your concern, but the Westfall family will not add to its obligations. We will find another way." Lydia watched Sebastian's jaw tighten with frustration, but he nodded with apparent acceptance. "Of course. Forgive me for overstepping." The remainder of the visit passed in a strange tension. Sebastian and Lydia found themselves drawn together despite the awkwardness of the refused loan. They walked in the gardens, discussing everything from politics to poetry, and Lydia felt something stirring in her chest that she had thought long dead. Not mere gratitude or appreciation for his kindness, but genuine attraction. A pull toward this complicated man who treated her as an intellectual equal. For his part, Sebastian found himself increasingly captivated. Miss Westfall's intelligence matched her dignity, and beneath both lay a warmth and humour that emerged when she felt safe enough to reveal it. He caught himself watching her more than propriety allowed, noting the way sunlight caught in her hair, the graceful movements of her hands as she spoke, the changing expressions that crossed her face during their conversations. But neither spoke of what was growing between them. The circumstances were too complicated, too fraught with the potential for misunderstanding. Sebastian feared that any declaration would be interpreted as an attempt to obligate her through affection. Lydia feared that her own feelings were a product of desperation, that she was confusing genuine attraction with the natural response to kindness shown in desperate circumstances. The return to London felt like emerging from a dream into harsh reality. The Westfall townhouse, which had seemed merely shabby before, now appeared almost squalid in comparison to Greymont's elegant comfort. The financial pressures that had briefly receded during their visit crashed back with renewed force. 2 days after their return, Lord Winters arrived unannounced. He brought with him a lawyer, a sharp-faced man named Hawthorne who carried a leather case bulging with documents. Lydia, descending the stairs as they were shown into her father's study, felt ice form in her stomach at the sight. She positioned herself outside the study door, not quite eavesdropping but close enough to hear the raised voices within. Winter's tone was smooth and poisonous as he laid out the reality of their situation. The debts would be called in immediately unless the Viscount agreed to certain terms. Those terms were spelled out in the documents Hawthorne produced, an agreement that Lydia would marry Harold Winters within 3 weeks, with the marriage contract specifying that any assets or income she might acquire would be subject to her husband's control. "You cannot be serious," The Viscount's voice was hoarse with shock. To force such a contract? I'm not forcing anything, Winters interrupted smoothly. I'm offering a solution. You have borrowed money you cannot repay. The law allows me to pursue collection through the courts, which will result in your imprisonment for debt. Is that what you prefer? To die in debtor's prison while your wife is turned into the streets? This is extortion. This is business, Winters corrected coldly. And you would do well to remember that I hold all the advantages here. Your daughter has already refused my son's generous offer once. That opportunity will not be extended again. Either you sign this agreement now, committing her to the marriage, or I proceed with legal action tomorrow. Through the door, Lydia heard her father's laboured breathing, the sound of a man trapped with no escape. She wanted to burst in, to refuse again, to damn the consequences. But the memory of his grey face during his previous episode stopped her. Another shock could kill him. I need time to consider, the Viscount said weakly. You have precisely as much time as it takes me to walk to the door, Winters replied. After that, my offer expires and the lawyers begin their work. Choose, Viscount, your daughter's hand or your family's complete destruction. The silence stretched unbearably. Then, in a voice that sounded like it was torn from his chest, the Viscount whispered, "Where do I sign?" Lydia pressed her hand to her mouth to stop the sound that wanted to escape. Through the door, she heard the scratch of pen on paper, Hawthorne's satisfied murmur as he witnessed the signature, Winters' triumph barely concealed beneath false sympathy. "Excellent," Winters said. "The wedding is scheduled for 3 weeks from today. I'll make all the arrangements. Your daughter need only appear and speak her vows." When the visitors finally departed, Lydia fled to her chamber before her father could emerge from the study. She stood at her window, staring blindly at the street below, trying to process what had just happened. In 3 weeks, she would be married to Harold Winters. In 3 weeks, her life as she knew it would end. A soft scratch at the door announced Molly's arrival. The young woman entered without waiting for permission, her face pale with shock. "Miss Lydia, I overheard something," she said urgently. "You need to know what Lord Winters' true purpose is." "What do you mean?" Lydia asked, though she barely had the strength to care. What could be worse than what had already transpired? "I was bringing tea to the drawing room, and I heard Lord Winters talking to his son," Molly explained, speaking quickly. "They didn't know I was there." "Miss Lydia, they were talking about money, about an inheritance." "What inheritance?" Lydia asked, confused. "We have no money." "Not from your father's side," Molly said. "From your mother's family. Your grandmother, Lady Pembroke's mother. She left a will." Lydia sank onto her bed, her mind racing. "What are you talking about? We were told grandmother left nothing." "She left you money, miss. A substantial sum. But the will specified that you couldn't touch it until you turned 7 and 20. That's in September, miss. Just 4 months from now." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Winters wasn't interested in Harold marrying a penniless Viscount's daughter. He was interested in controlling the fortune she would inherit in 4 months. Once she was married, any assets she acquired would legally belong to her husband. Harold would have complete control over her grandmother's bequest. "How do you know this?" Lydia demanded. "I heard Harold laughing about it," Molly said, her voice shaking with anger, saying that marrying a spinster was a small price to pay for thousands of pounds. Lord Winters told him that his solicitor had found the will in the public records. "They've known about your inheritance this whole time, miss. That's why they've been so determined to force this marriage." Lydia felt as though she might be sick. Her parents didn't know. They had genuinely believed the family had no resources, no hope beyond submission to Winters' demands. But all along, Winters had been playing a longer game, positioning himself to seize an inheritance that should have secured her independence. She found her mother in the drawing room, her face buried in her hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Lady Westfall looked up as Lydia entered, her eyes red and swollen. "I'm sorry," her mother whispered. "I'm so sorry, Lydia. We failed you completely." "Mother," Lydia said, keeping her voice steady with effort, "tell me about grandmother's will, about the inheritance." Lady Westfall's face paled further. How did you— Tell me, Lydia repeated firmly. The story emerged in halting sentences. Lydia's maternal grandmother had indeed left her a considerable sum, approximately £4,000, with the provision that it could not be accessed until her granddaughter's 27th birthday. Lady Westfall had kept this information secret, partly from shame that they couldn't access the money when they needed it desperately, partly from a misguided belief that knowing about wealth she couldn't touch would only make their poverty more painful. "Why didn't you tell me?" Lydia asked, fighting to control her anger and hurt. "I thought it would be cruel," her mother said weakly, "to know you had money but couldn't use it. And your father's pride. He didn't want anyone thinking we were holding out hope of rescue from your inheritance." "Mother," Lydia said with forced patience, "Winters knows about the inheritance. That's why he's forcing this marriage. Once I'm married to Harold, he'll control that money the moment I turn 27 in September." Lady Westfall's eyes widened with horror. "No, surely not. He said, he told us he wanted to help, that Harold had developed an attachment." "He lied," Lydia said flatly. "He investigated our family's financial records, found the will, and constructed this entire scheme to seize my inheritance. We've been played for fools from the beginning." The enormity of Winter's manipulation settled over them both. He had carefully orchestrated their desperation, ensuring they had no resources, no options, no hope of escape. He had sabotaged Lydia's employment prospects, pressured them with impossible debts, and now trapped them with a legally binding agreement signed under duress. And in 3 weeks, unless something changed dramatically, Lydia would become Harold Winter's wife, her inheritance would pass into his control, and her life would be effectively over. That night, Lydia sat at her writing desk and penned a letter to Sebastian. She explained everything. The agreement her father had been forced to sign, the discovery of her inheritance, Winter's true motives, the timeline that gave them barely 3 weeks before the wedding. She didn't ask for help directly, but she made clear that they were trapped and desperate, that any legal expertise or advice he could provide would be gratefully received. She sealed the letter with trembling hands and gave it to Molly to deliver the following morning. It was a risk, revealing their complete vulnerability to a man she barely knew, but Sebastian had shown her kindness when he had no reason to, had treated her with respect and genuine interest. If anyone might help them find a legal escape from Winter's trap, it would be him, and if he chose not to involve himself in their mess, at least she would know where she truly stood before she walked into the prison of Harold Winter's arms. Sebastian's response arrived within hours of receiving Lydia's desperate letter, delivered by a rider who looked as though he had pushed his horse to its limits. The Duke's handwriting was bold and decisive across the expensive paper. "Miss Westfall, I have read your letter with grave concern. The situation you describe is both unconscionable and, I believe, legally questionable. An agreement signed under such duress may not be binding. I am placing my solicitors at your disposal immediately. Mr. Peter Thornton, the finest legal mind in London, will call upon your father tomorrow morning to review the documents and explore every possible avenue of escape from this trap. In the meantime, please know that you are not alone in this fight. I remain your devoted servant, Greymont." Lydia clutched the letter to her chest, allowing herself one moment of hope before reality reasserted itself. Even the finest legal mind in London would struggle against an agreement her father had willingly signed, however coerced he might have felt. The following morning brought Mr. Thornton, a sharp-eyed gentleman of middle years, whose calm demeanour inspired confidence. He spent 2 hours closeted with the Viscount, reviewing every clause of the marriage contract Winters had forced him to sign. When he emerged, his expression was carefully neutral. "The agreement is cleverly constructed," he admitted to the family assembled in the drawing room. "Lord Winters has been careful to ensure most provisions would hold up in court. However, there are potential grounds for challenge. If we can demonstrate that the Viscount was coerced through threats to his health and well-being, if we can prove that Winters deliberately misrepresented his intentions regarding Miss Westfall's inheritance, we may be able to invalidate the contract." How long would such a challenge take?" Lydia asked, though she feared she already knew. "Weeks at minimum, possibly months," Thornton replied honestly. The courts move slowly, and Winters has resources to drag out proceedings indefinitely. And in the meantime, what prevents him from demanding the marriage proceed as scheduled? Lady Westfall asked, her voice thin with stress. Nothing, legally, Thornton admitted. Unless we obtain an injunction, which would require substantial evidence of wrongdoing that we don't yet possess. The Viscount, who had been sitting silently throughout this discussion, suddenly pressed a hand to his chest, his face going grey. Lady Westfall rushed to his side with a cry of alarm. "Edmund! Not again, please!" Dr. Harrison was summoned once more, and his diagnosis was grimmer than before. The Viscount's heart had weakened further, and any additional stress could prove immediately fatal. He prescribed absolute rest and quiet, forbidding any discussion of business or legal matters in the patient's presence. Lydia stood outside her father's chamber, listening to his laboured breathing, and felt the walls closing in. They couldn't pursue legal action against Winters without risking her father's life. The stress of a court battle would kill him as surely as debtor's prison would have. But she couldn't simply accept Harold Winters as her husband, couldn't surrender herself and her inheritance to men who had schemed so coldly to trap her. The following day, Sebastian called in person. He and Lydia walked in the small garden behind the house, speaking in low voices, while Molly served as a distant but proper chaperone. "Thornton tells me the legal path is difficult," Sebastian said, his frustration evident. "But not impossible, Miss Westfall. With time and resources." "Time we don't have," Lydia interrupted gently. "And my father's health cannot withstand a prolonged legal battle. Dr. Harrison has made that clear." "Then what will you do?" Sebastian asked, and the concern in his voice made her heart ache. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to flee to Scotland, to my aunt's estate. But that would only delay the inevitable, and Winters would pursue us there. He's invested too much in this scheme to let me escape easily." Sebastian was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working as though wrestling with words he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the right way to express. Finally, he said, "If there were another option, an alternative that would free you from Winters' control without endangering your father, would you consider it?" "What alternative could possibly exist?" Lydia asked, though something in his tone made her pulse quicken. Before he could answer, Molly appeared at the garden gate, her face pale with alarm. "Miss Lydia, you must come inside immediately. Lord Winters has arrived, and he's demanding to see you." The scene that greeted them in the drawing room was tense. Winters stood near the fireplace, his portly frame radiating satisfaction and menace in equal measure. Harold lurked behind him, a thin young man with cold eyes and a cruel mouth that curved in a smile as Lydia entered. "Miss Westfall," Winters said with false courtesy. "How delightful to see you looking so well. I've come to discuss the wedding arrangements." "There's nothing to discuss," Lydia said, keeping her voice steady. "I have not agreed to any marriage." "Your father has agreed on your behalf," Winters countered smoothly. "The contract is binding and properly executed. The ceremony will take place 3 weeks from today, as specified in the agreement. I merely wish to inform you that I've taken the liberty of engaging a modiste to provide your wedding attire. We wouldn't want you appearing in rags at such an important occasion." The calculated cruelty of the remark made Lydia's hands clench at her sides, but she refused to give him the satisfaction of a visible reaction. "You're very thorough in your planning, Lord Winters," she said coldly. "One might almost think you had been orchestrating this for some time." Something flickered in Winters' eyes, a flash of wariness quickly concealed. "I merely wish to ensure all proceeds smoothly. After all, once you and Harold are wed, we'll be family. I have every interest in your happiness and comfort." "How considerate," Lydia replied, her tone making clear she believed nothing of the sort. After Winters departed, promising to return with details about the ceremony, Lydia made a decision. She couldn't fight Winters through legal channels without killing her father. She couldn't marry Harold and surrender control of her inheritance and her life. That left only one option. She would contact Sebastian's solicitors directly and instruct them to begin investigating any possible irregularities in Winters' business dealings. If they could find evidence of other schemes, other families he had defrauded, perhaps they could build a case strong enough to discredit him entirely. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all she had left. The investigation began quietly. Mr. Thornton's clerks made discreet inquiries among other noble families, searching for patterns of loans followed by forced marriages or property seizures. What they discovered was damning. Winters had orchestrated at least 5 similar schemes over the past decade, each following the same blueprint of lending money to struggling nobility and then extracting marriages or estates when repayment became impossible. But discovering the pattern and proving it in court were different matters. The families involved were ashamed, unwilling to admit publicly that they had been manipulated. Building a case would take time, and time was the one resource Lydia didn't possess. A week passed in a blur of whispered meetings, sealed letters, and careful footsteps in corridors where servants might be listening. 2 weeks before the scheduled wedding, everything changed. Winter's spy network, which had served him so well in the past, brought news that sent him into a cold fury. The Duke of Greymont's solicitors were investigating his business dealings, asking questions about past loans and marriages, gathering evidence that could potentially unravel his entire operation, and they were doing so at Miss Lydia Westfall's request. Winters sat in his study that evening, contemplating the intelligence his informant had provided. The investigation was still in its early stages, but if Greymont's lawyers had enough time, they might indeed find sufficient evidence to challenge the marriage contract or even bring criminal charges. The Duke's resources were vast, his influence considerable, and his apparent interest in Miss Westfall suggested a personal investment that made him dangerous. Winters couldn't afford to wait 3 weeks for a wedding that might never happen. He needed to act immediately, to secure his prize before Greymont's interference could destroy everything. "Harold!" he called, and his son appeared in the doorway, with that perpetual sneer that Winters found both irritating and useful. "We're moving up our timeline. I want you to take Miss Westfall to the estate in Kent tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Harold's eyes widened. "But the arrangements—" "Damn the arrangements," Winters snapped. "That meddling Duke is causing problems. We need to get her away from London and married before he can interfere further." "How do you propose we accomplish that?" Harold asked. "She's not going to come willingly." Winters smiled, a cold expression that held no humour. "Then we'll simply have to ensure she has no choice in the matter." The next morning dawned bright and clear, with no hint of the violence it would bring. Lydia, exhausted from another sleepless night spent worrying about her impossible situation, decided to take a walk in the park. The exercise and fresh air might clear her head enough to think of some solution she had overlooked. Molly insisted on accompanying her, as she always did, and they set out shortly after breakfast. The park was quiet at this hour, with few people about, except for servants on early errands and 1 or 2 determined riders exercising their horses. They had walked perhaps 10 minutes when a carriage appeared on the path ahead of them, moving at a speed inappropriate for the narrow track. Lydia stepped aside to let it pass, but instead of continuing, the vehicle stopped abruptly, blocking their path. 3 men jumped down, their faces hidden behind dark scarves. Before Lydia could even cry out, they had seized her arms, their grips bruising in their strength. "Let go of her," Molly screamed, rushing forward to claw at the nearest man. He backhanded her casually, sending her sprawling onto the gravel path with a cry of pain. Lydia fought with every ounce of strength she possessed, kicking and struggling, but the men were too strong and too prepared. They lifted her bodily and threw her into the carriage, one climbing in after her, while the other 2 mounted the driver's box. "Molly!" Lydia shouted through the window as the carriage lurched into motion. "Get help! Find the Duke!" She saw Molly pushing herself up from the ground, blood streaming from a cut on her forehead, and then the carriage turned a corner and her maid disappeared from view. Inside the vehicle, Lydia rounded on her captor, who had removed his scarf to reveal Harold Winters' cruel face. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, fear and fury making her voice shake. "This is kidnapping. You'll hang for this." "We're saving you from yourself," Harold replied, his smile making her stomach turn. "Father has tired of your delays and your investigation. We're going to the Kent estate, where a very accommodating priest is waiting to perform a marriage ceremony. We have a special license, and witnesses who will sign what they are paid to sign. In a few hours, your name will be entered into a register, and the world will call you Mrs. Winters. Enough to bind you with scandal and confusion. Enough to slow any help long enough for father to move on your inheritance. I'll never agree, Lydia said flatly. You can drag me to a church, but you cannot make me speak. Harold's expression darkened. Words are a luxury for people with choices. Once we're alone at the estate, choices shrink. You can cooperate and keep your family safe, or you can fight and watch the consequences land on everyone you claim to protect. The threat was unmistakable, and Lydia felt ice flood her veins. But she refused to let him see her fear. Instead, she turned her attention to her surroundings, noting every detail of their route, searching for any possible means of escape. They were heading south and east, avoiding the main roads in favor of smaller lanes that offered fewer witnesses. The carriage moved at punishing speed, its occupants clearly anxious to reach their destination before any pursuit could be organized. Lydia's mind raced. The rope binding her wrists had been tied hastily, more focused on speed than security. If she could work it loose without Harold noticing, if she could find a moment when the carriage slowed enough to make escape possible. It was a desperate plan, with almost no chance of success. But as the miles passed and London disappeared behind them, Lydia began working at the knots with patient determination. Behind them, Molly picked herself up from the park path, blood dripping into her eyes. Several people had witnessed the abduction, but they stood frozen in shock, uncertain what to do. Molly didn't hesitate. She had served Miss Lydia since she was 14, had watched her sacrifice everything for an ungrateful family, had seen her struggle with dignity through poverty, and now this ultimate threat. She knew exactly where help could be found. Pressing one hand to the cut on her forehead, Molly began to run. The carriage rattled over rough country roads, each jolt sending fresh waves of fear through Lydia's body. Harold sat across from her, his legs stretched out in casual possession of the space, watching her with an expression that made her skin crawl. "You might as well make yourself comfortable," he said, examining his fingernails with studied indifference. "We've got about 15 miles to cover, and Father's estate isn't exactly accessible by main roads. Wouldn't want anyone witnessing our little journey after all." "People saw you take me," Lydia said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Witnesses observed the entire abduction. You cannot possibly think you'll escape justice for this." Harold laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "Justice? My dear Miss Westfall, justice belongs to those who can afford it. By the time anyone organizes a response, you'll already be my wife, and a wife cannot testify against her husband. Rather convenient, don't you think? The marriage won't be legal," Lydia insisted, though her heart sank at the confidence in his tone. "Coercion invalidates consent." "Does it?" Harold leaned forward, his brown eyes glittering with malice. "Father has ensured every legal requirement will be met. The priest is properly ordained, if somewhat flexible in his interpretation of canonical law. You'll speak your vows, or you'll find yourself in a position far worse than merely married. I can be creative when properly motivated, Miss Westfall, and Father's estate is quite isolated. No one will hear you scream." The crude threat hung in the air between them. Lydia turned her face to the window, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her terror. Instead, she focused on observation, on gathering information that might somehow prove useful. They were travelling southeast based on the sun's position. The roads had deteriorated from London's well-maintained thoroughfares to rutted country lanes barely wide enough for the carriage. She glimpsed a milestone marker reading 7 Oaks 8 miles, which gave her some sense of their location. The Kent countryside rolled past in shades of green, peaceful farmland that contrasted grotesquely with her circumstances. Behind her back, her fingers worked at the rope binding her wrists. Harold's men had tied the knots hastily, more concerned with speed than security. She could feel a slight give in the hemp, a looseness that suggested the binding might not hold if she worked at it patiently enough. The key was not letting Harold notice what she was doing. "Father will be pleased when I bring you home already secured," Harold continued, apparently enjoying the sound of his own voice. "He worried you might prove difficult, but I assured him I could handle one spinster with delusions of independence. After all, what can you possibly do? Fight 3 grown men? Jump from a moving carriage? He laughed again at the absurdity of such notions, and Lydia filed the information away. 3 men. Harold inside the carriage with her, and 2 others on the driver's box. She had glimpsed them briefly during the abduction, large and brutish, the sort of hired muscle that could be found in any London slum for the right price. The inheritance is quite substantial, I understand, Harold said, shifting topics with the casual cruelty of someone discussing the weather. £4,000. Father's solicitor verified the amount through public records. Grandmother was quite generous, wasn't she? Pity she tied it up until your 27th birthday, but that's only 4 months away. September 15th, if I recall correctly. You've done your research, Lydia said coldly, still working at the ropes behind her back. She could feel the knot beginning to loosen, tiny increments of progress that gave her the first faint hope since the abduction began. Father believes in thorough preparation, Harold replied. He's been planning this for nearly a year, you know, from the moment he discovered your grandmother's will in the registry. Everything that followed, the loans to your father, the mounting pressure, the marriage proposal, all of it was designed to place you exactly where we needed you to be. The casual admission of such calculated manipulation made Lydia's stomach turn. An entire year of her family's suffering, her father's declining health, her mother's anxiety, all orchestrated by the man sitting across from her with that satisfied smirk on his face. You're a monster, she said quietly. I'm a businessman, Harold corrected, though I suppose from your perspective the distinction might seem academic. Ah, we're making excellent time. At this pace, we'll reach the estate by early afternoon. The priest should be waiting, and we can conclude this matter before nightfall. The carriage hit a particularly deep rut, throwing Lydia against the side panel. She used the moment of confusion to work more aggressively at the ropes and felt the blessed relief of the knot finally giving way. Her hands were free, though she kept them positioned behind her back as though still bound. Harold, absorbed in his own monologue about the wedding arrangements, noticed nothing. Outside the carriage, the 2 men on the driver's box conversed in low voices that occasionally carried through the window. 15 miles for £50, one grumbled. Hardly seems worth the risk if someone reports the abduction. Lord Winters pays well for silence, the other replied. And who's going to pursue us? The girl's family has no resources, and by the time anyone organises a search, we'll be long gone. Their voices faded as the wind shifted direction, but Lydia had heard enough. These were mercenaries, loyal only to Winter's money. They had no personal investment in the outcome beyond their payment, which meant they might scatter if genuine opposition appeared. If, such a fragile word to build hope upon. Meanwhile, in London, Molly ran through the streets with blood streaming down her face, her breath coming in ragged gasps. People stared as she passed, some calling out in concern, but she didn't stop. Greymont House in Mayfair was more than a mile from the park, and every second counted. By the time she stumbled through the gates and up to the front entrance, her legs were shaking with exhaustion, and her vision had narrowed to a tunnel. She pounded on the door with both fists, not caring about propriety or proper procedure. A footman opened the door, his expression shifting from annoyance to alarm as he took in her bloodied face and desperate manner. "I need to see the Duke," Molly gasped. "Now! It's Miss Westfall. They've taken her. See here, you can't just—" the footman began, but Molly pushed past him into the entrance hall. "Get the Duke!" she shouted, her voice cracking. "For God's sake, get him now!" The commotion brought Sebastian from his study at a run. He took one look at Molly's condition and barked orders with military precision. "Mrs. Davies, tend to this woman's injuries. You," he pointed at the footman. "Fetch Captain Denham immediately. Tell him to bring 6 mounted men, armed and ready to ride. Move." He turned to Molly, his blue eyes intense with focused concern. "Tell me everything, quickly." "They took Miss Lydia in the park, Your Grace," Molly said, swaying on her feet as adrenaline began to fade. 3 men, faces covered. "Threw her in a carriage and drove off heading southeast. She shouted for me to find you." "How long ago?" Sebastian demanded. "Half an hour, maybe more," Molly said, pressing a hand to her bleeding forehead. "I ran as fast as I could." Sebastian's jaw tightened. Half an hour gave the kidnappers a substantial head start, but not an insurmountable one. The carriage, what did it look like? Black, unmarked, pulled by 4 horses, Molly described. 2 men on the driver's box, one inside with Miss Lydia. She was fighting them, Your Grace. She didn't go willingly. She wouldn't, Sebastian said, something fierce and protective flashing across his features. Southeast, you said? Yes, Your Grace. Toward Kent, I think. Sebastian's mind raced through the geography. Kent, where Winters owned property. Of course. He would take Lydia somewhere isolated, somewhere he controlled completely. The estate would be approximately 15 miles from London on secondary roads, chosen specifically for its distance from witnesses and authority. Captain Richard Denham arrived within minutes, a tall military man with sharp features and the bearing of someone accustomed to action. Behind him came 6 riders, all former soldiers who served as part of Sebastian's household staff, men who knew how to handle themselves in dangerous situations. Lord Winters has abducted Miss Westfall, Sebastian said without preamble, already moving toward the stables. They have a half-hour lead heading southeast toward his Kent estate. We ride immediately. Weapons, Your Grace, Denham asked. Whatever you can carry, Sebastian replied grimly. If Winters or his men resist, I want options. Within 5 minutes, they were mounted and galloping through London's streets, scattering pedestrians and drawing outraged shouts from those forced to leap aside. Sebastian paid no attention to propriety or social consequences. The only thing that mattered was reaching Lydia before Winters could force through whatever scheme he had planned. They cleared the city limits and pushed their horses harder, following the southeastern road toward Kent. Sebastian leaned low over his mount's neck, urging every ounce of speed from the powerful animal beneath him. The others matched his pace, spreading out in a formation that allowed them to cover ground efficiently while watching for any sign of the black carriage. Inside that carriage, Lydia felt the vehicle's speed gradually decrease as they began climbing a steep hill. The horses strained against the incline, their pace dropping from a canter to a laboured trot. Harold noticed nothing, still absorbed in his own self-satisfied monologue about the wedding feast his father had planned. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance. Lydia's muscles tensed as she calculated angles and distances. The carriage was moving slowly enough that a fall might not kill her, but fast enough that injury was virtually guaranteed. Could she reach the door handle before Harold reacted? Could she get it open and throw herself clear before he grabbed her? The alternative was reaching Winters' estate, being forced through a mockery of a marriage ceremony, and spending the rest of her life as Harold's property. The choice, when framed that way, became suddenly clear. Lydia took a deep breath and prepared to move. Lydia moved with explosive force born of desperation. Her freed hands shot forward, shoving Harold backward with all her strength. The sudden attack caught him completely off guard, and he fell against the opposite seat with a startled curse. She didn't wait to see his reaction. In one fluid motion, she threw herself toward the door, her fingers scrabbling for the handle. The metal was cold beneath her palm as she twisted and pulled, praying it wasn't locked from the outside. The door flew open with a violence that nearly pulled her out immediately. Wind rushed into the confined space, cold and fierce, carrying the scent of earth and growing things. The road flashed past below, a blur of packed dirt and scattered stones that looked suddenly very far away and very hard. "You stupid girl!" Harold shouted, lunging for her. His fingers caught the fabric of her dress at the shoulder, and she heard the sickening sound of expensive muslin tearing as she pulled away. Lydia looked down at the rushing ground and felt her courage waver. This was madness. She would be killed or badly injured. But then Harold's hand grabbed her arm, his grip bruising, and she remembered what awaited her at Winters' estate. Death or injury seemed preferable to that fate. Then, cutting through the chaos of wind and Harold's shouted curses, she heard it. The thunder of hooves approaching at tremendous speed. Multiple horses riding hard, gaining on the struggling carriage with every passing second. Lydia twisted in Harold's grip and looked back. Her heart stopped, then restarted with a painful lurch. Sebastian. He rode at the head of a group of mounted men, his dark coat streaming behind him, his face set in lines of fierce determination. He was leaning low over his horse's neck, pushing the animal to speeds that seemed impossible, closing the distance between them with breathtaking velocity. Their eyes met across the shrinking gap, and in that instant, Lydia saw everything she needed to know. He had come for her. He would catch her. She just had to trust him enough to jump. "Jump!" Sebastian's shout carried over the pounding hooves and rattling carriage wheels. "Lydia, jump to me!" His arm extended toward her, reaching across the impossible space, steady despite the speed of his mount. The gesture was both command and promise, an assurance that he would be there, that he would not let her fall. Harold's other hand grabbed a fistful of her hair, yanking her head back painfully. "You're not going anywhere," he snarled, trying to drag her away from the open door. The pain focused Lydia's mind with crystal clarity. She drove her elbow backward into Harold's ribs with all the force she could muster. His grip loosened just enough, and she made her choice. Lydia jumped. Time seemed to suspend itself in that moment. She felt the carriage fall away beneath her, felt gravity assert its claim, felt the wind catch her torn dress and whip it around her legs. The ground rushed up to meet her, hard and unforgiving, and she had one terrible instant to wonder if she had made a catastrophic mistake. Then Sebastian was there, his arm locked around her waist with the precision of a cavalry officer trained to snatch objects from the ground at full gallop. The impact drove the air from her lungs, and the momentum nearly unseated them both. The horse stumbled, throwing its head up in protest at the sudden shift in weight, but Sebastian's thighs gripped with iron strength, and his free hand controlled the reins with absolute authority. They swayed dangerously, tilting so far that Lydia could see the ground rushing past mere inches from her face. Then Sebastian's powerful shoulders shifted, his body moving with the horse rather than against it, and they righted themselves with a jar that rattled her teeth. "I've got you!" Sebastian gasped against her ear, his arm crushing her against his chest. "You're safe. I've got you." Lydia couldn't respond. Her hands clutched desperately at his coat, her face pressed against the solid warmth of his shoulder, and she felt something break open inside her chest that might have been relief or terror, or both at once. Around them, Sebastian's men executed their part of the rescue with military precision. Captain Denham and 2 others had already swept past, positioning their horses to block the carriage's path. The driver, seeing armed men bearing down on him, pulled hard on the reins. The carriage lurched to a violent stop, throwing Harold against the far wall with a satisfying crash. The 2 men on the driver's box attempted to flee, leaping down and running for the cover of nearby trees. They made it perhaps 20 yards before the remaining riders cut off their escape, pistols drawn and aimed with steady hands. "On the ground now!" Denham barked, his voice carrying the weight of command earned on battlefields, far more dangerous than a Kent country road. The hired thugs dropped immediately, hands raised in surrender. Whatever Winters was paying them, it wasn't enough to die for. Sebastian brought his horse to a halt at a safe distance from the stopped carriage and dismounted with Lydia still held tightly in his arms. He lowered her gently to the ground, his hands running over her shoulders and arms, checking for injuries with a thoroughness that spoke of experience with battlefield casualties. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his blue eyes intense with concern. "Did they harm you?" "I'm not injured," Lydia managed, though her voice shook. "Frightened, but not hurt." "Your dress is torn," Sebastian said, his jaw tightening as he noted the ripped fabric at her shoulder and the bruises already forming on her arm where Harold had gripped her. "Harold tried to stop me from jumping," Lydia explained. "But it's nothing serious. Sebastian, Whatever she had been about to say dissolved into incoherent sound as the reality of what had just happened crashed over her. She had been kidnapped. She had jumped from a moving carriage. She could have been killed. Harold had intended to force her into marriage, to use her, to take everything from her. The shaking started in her hands and spread rapidly through her entire body. Her knees buckled, and she would have fallen if Sebastian hadn't caught her, supporting her weight as though she weighed nothing. "Easy," he murmured. lowering her to sit on a grassy bank beside the road. "You're safe now. It's over." But it wasn't over. Not really. Lydia's breath came in short, panicked gasps that she couldn't seem to control. The world tilted and spun around her, and she pressed her hands to her face as sobs tore from her throat. Sebastian knelt beside her and pulled her against his chest, wrapping his riding coat around her shaking form. One hand cradled the back of her head, while the other held her securely, and he simply let her cry, murmuring wordless reassurances until the storm passed. When Lydia finally regained some measure of control, she found herself wrapped in Sebastian's coat, with her face buried against his waistcoat. She could hear his heart beating steadily beneath her ear, feel the rise and fall of his breathing, and the solid reality of his presence slowly anchored her back to herself. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I don't usually fall apart like this." "You were abducted and forced to jump from a moving carriage," Sebastian said firmly. "I think you're entitled to fall apart. In fact, I would be concerned if you weren't shaken." Behind them, Denham and his men had extracted Harold from the carriage and secured all three captors with rope from the driver's box. Harold's face was purple with rage, and he shouted threats and curses that Denham ignored with the calm of a man who had faced far more intimidating enemies. "You'll pay for this!" Harold screamed towards Sebastian. "My father will see you ruined. You have no right to interfere in a legal marriage contract." "The only thing legal about this situation is the kidnapping charge you'll be facing," Sebastian replied, without looking up from Lydia. "I have multiple witnesses to the abduction, including the lady's own testimony. Your father's contract won't save you from the consequences of violence against a gentlewoman." He rose, helping Lydia to her feet with careful support. "Can you ride? My horse can carry us both back to London." "I can ride," Lydia said, though she wasn't entirely certain it was true. Her legs still felt unsteady, and her hands continued to tremble. Sebastian must have sensed her uncertainty because he lifted her onto his horse, without waiting for further confirmation, then mounted behind her. His arms bracketed her securely as he took up the reins, creating a cage of protection that made her feel safer than she had in weeks. The journey back to London took on the quality of a strange dream. Sebastian's men led the prisoners on foot, hands bound, and expressions ranging from Harold's impotent fury to the hired thug's sullen resignation. Lydia sat in front of Sebastian, her body gradually relaxing against his as exhaustion replaced adrenaline. "Where are we going?" she asked as the outskirts of London came into view. "Greymont House," Sebastian replied, and she felt him tense slightly, as though anticipating argument. "I'm taking you somewhere safe." "Not home?" Lydia asked, though the thought of returning to her parents' townhouse held no appeal. "Your home isn't secure," Sebastian said firmly. "Winters orchestrated one abduction. I won't give him opportunity for another. You'll stay at Greymont House under my protection until this situation is resolved completely." "The scandal," Lydia said weakly. "My reputation will be destroyed if I'm seen staying unchaperoned in your house." "Your reputation will survive," Sebastian said, his voice carrying absolute certainty. "And if it doesn't, then society can go hang itself. Your safety matters more than propriety." They rode through London's streets as afternoon faded toward evening. People stared at the strange procession, the Duke riding with a dishevelled woman in his arms, the bound prisoners being marched behind. But Sebastian ignored them all with magnificent indifference. At Greymont House, Mrs. Daventry met them at the door with the unflappable efficiency of a housekeeper who had seen everything. She took one look at Lydia's condition and immediately began issuing orders to the staff. Hot bath drawn in the blue guest chamber, clean clothing prepared, tea and light supper sent up immediately, she directed. And someone fetch Dr. Harrison to examine Miss Westfall for injuries. "I'm not injured," Lydia protested weakly, but Mrs. Daventry fixed her with a look that brooked no argument. "You'll be examined by a physician nonetheless, miss. His Grace would never forgive me if I failed to ensure your well-being." While Lydia was swept away by the household staff, Sebastian dealt with the prisoners. He personally delivered Harold Winters and his accomplices to the magistrate, along with a detailed account of the kidnapping and attempted forced marriage. The evidence was overwhelming. multiple witnesses to the abduction, Lydia's torn dress and visible bruises, Harold's own words during the rescue. By the time Sebastian returned to Greymont House, full night had fallen. He found Dr. Harrison in the entrance hall, preparing to depart. "How is she?" Sebastian demanded. "Bruised and shaken but not seriously harmed," the doctor reported. "The young lady was remarkably fortunate. Mrs. Daventry has her settled comfortably in the guest chamber with strict orders to rest. I've left a draft to help her sleep, should she need it." After the doctor departed, Sebastian stood in his study, staring at nothing, the events of the day replaying in his mind. The terror he had felt when Molly arrived with the news of the abduction, the desperate race through the countryside, the heart-stopping moment when Lydia had jumped from that carriage, trusting him to catch her. She could have died. If he had been even seconds slower, if his horse had stumbled, if his aim had been less precise, she would have fallen beneath the carriage wheels or struck her head on the road. The thought made him feel physically ill. He had never believed in love at first sight, had dismissed it as romantic nonsense unsuited to practical men. But he could no longer deny what he felt for Lydia Westfall. It had started with admiration for her intelligence and dignity, had grown through their conversations into genuine affection, and had crystallized in that moment when she jumped into his arms with absolute faith that he would catch her. He loved her, completely, with an intensity that terrified him. And tomorrow, when her parents arrived in outrage and concern, he would have to find a way to protect her reputation while honoring her independence. It would require delicacy, diplomacy, and very careful handling of both the Westfalls and society's inevitable judgment. But tonight, she was safe under his roof, and that would have to be enough. The morning after the rescue brought complications Sebastian had anticipated, but hoped to minimize. News of Miss Lydia Westfall spending the night at Greymont House had spread through London's servants' networks with the speed of wildfire, and by the time Viscount and Lady Westfall arrived at his door, the scandal was already taking shape. Sebastian received them in his study, where he explained the previous day's events with careful precision. The kidnapping, the pursuit, the rescue, and his decision to bring Lydia directly to Greymont House rather than return her to a residence Winters clearly viewed as vulnerable. "You had no right," Lady Westfall said, though her voice lacked conviction, "to keep our daughter without our knowledge or consent." "I had every right to ensure her safety," Sebastian replied firmly, "and I would make the same choice again without hesitation. Miss Westfall was traumatized and injured. She needed immediate care in a secure location. Your townhouse offers neither security nor adequate staff to provide proper attention." "Where is she now?" the Viscount asked. His colour was terrible, grey and drawn, and he leaned heavily on his walking stick. "Resting upstairs under Mrs. Daventry's supervision," Sebastian said. "Dr. Harrison examined her last night and found no serious injuries beyond bruising and shock. He recommended rest and quiet, which she is receiving." The Viscount sank into a chair, his hand pressed to his chest. "This is all my fault. I signed that damned agreement. I put her in Winter's power." "You were coerced through threats to your health and your family's well-being," Sebastian said. "No court will uphold a contract signed under such duress, particularly not now that Winters and his son face criminal charges for kidnapping." "Criminal charges?" Lady Westfall asked sharply. "I personally delivered them to the magistrate last night, along with multiple witnesses and physical evidence," Sebastian confirmed. "The case is clear and compelling. They will be held pending trial." He paused, then added carefully, "During the investigation of Harold's possessions, certain letters were discovered, correspondence between father and son discussing their scheme to force the marriage and seize Miss Westfall's inheritance. The letters are quite explicit about their intentions and methods. The evidence had indeed been damning. Harold, in his arrogance, had kept detailed records of the entire conspiracy, likely for protection against his father's potential betrayal. Those records now provided proof of calculated fraud and coercion that would destroy both Winter's men in court. "What about Lydia's reputation?" Lady Westfall asked, returning to her primary concern. "An unmarried woman spending even one night in a bachelor's household." "Will be addressed," Sebastian interrupted, his tone making clear he had already considered this problem. I intend to court Miss Westfall properly, with marriage as the ultimate goal. My intentions are entirely honourable, and I will make that clear to anyone who dares to suggest otherwise. And Lady Pembroke? Lady Westfall asked softly, as if speaking the name might summon the last remaining thread of hope. I wrote to her the moment I brought Lydia here, Sebastian said. Her ladyship is still abroad, but my message reached her by courier. She has promised her protection and her name, and she will return as soon as she can. Until then, she has offered to make it very clear, to anyone who matters, that Lydia was taken and held against her will. The silence that followed was profound. The Viscount and his wife stared at Sebastian, as though he had announced his intention to abdicate his title and join a circus. You wish to marry our daughter, the Viscount finally managed. I wish to court her with that aim, yes, Sebastian clarified. Whether she accepts my suit is, of course, entirely her decision. But my interest in Miss Westfall predates yesterday's rescue by several weeks. I have admired her intelligence, her dignity, and her strength since we first met at the Haverford ball. She has no dowry, Lady Westfall said automatically, as though this might somehow have escaped Sebastian's notice. I am aware, Sebastian replied dryly. I am also aware that she will inherit £4,000 in September when she turns 27, though I assure you, my interest in your daughter has nothing to do with her financial prospects and everything to do with her character. When Lydia was finally allowed visitors later that morning, she found her parents in the drawing room looking shell-shocked. Her mother immediately burst into tears, while her father simply stared at her with an expression that might have been guilt or relief or both. Are you truly all right? The Viscount asked, his voice rough with emotion. I am, Lydia assured him, taking his hand. Thanks to the Duke's intervention. If he hadn't come when he did... She couldn't finish the sentence, the memory of Harold's threats still too fresh, too real. This is my fault, her father said, tears streaming down his weathered face. I should have protected you. Instead, I delivered you into that monster's hands. You were trapped, Lydia said gently. Winters engineered the entire situation to leave you no choice. This was never your fault, father. Over the following weeks, the scandal that Lady Westfall had feared materialized, but took a different shape than expected. Yes, there was talk about Miss Westfall staying at Greymont House. But the circumstances of the kidnapping, the Duke's heroic rescue, and his immediate declaration of honourable intentions transformed potential ruin into something closer to a romance from a novel. Lydia initially resisted Sebastian's announced courtship with surprising vehemence. You don't owe me anything, she told him during one of their carefully chaperoned meetings in Mrs. Daventry's constant presence. I won't be your obligation, some woman you feel compelled to marry because you saved her life. Is that truly what you think? Sebastian asked, his blue eyes intense. That I'm courting you from obligation. What else could it be? Lydia countered. Before the kidnapping, you were kind to my family, yes. But marriage? That's a far different matter. I loved you before the kidnapping, Sebastian said quietly, and the simple statement fell between them like a stone into still water. I loved you from that first conversation at the Haverford ball, when you spoke to me as though I were simply a man rather than a title. I loved you in my library when you argued political philosophy with more insight than half the men in Parliament. I loved you when you refused to compromise your principles, even when it would have been easier to surrender. Lydia stared at him, her heart hammering. You cannot mean that. I have never meant anything more in my life, Sebastian replied. But I understand if you need time to trust that truth. I can wait, Lydia. I will wait as long as necessary for you to believe that my feelings are genuine and have nothing to do with yesterday's heroics. The courtship that followed was conducted under the strictest propriety. Sebastian called at Greymont House, where Lydia had been installed as a guest until the scandal died down. They walked in the gardens with Mrs. Daventry following at a discreet distance. They discussed books and politics and their respective childhoods. They played chess, which Sebastian won more often, but Lydia won more cleverly. They simply talked, for hours at a time, discovering the 1,000 small compatibilities that make two people suited for a lifetime together. And gradually, Lydia allowed herself to believe what her heart had known from the beginning, that Sebastian's feelings were real, that he valued her for herself rather than from obligation, that what they were building together was genuine partnership rather than rescue and gratitude. In July, the trial of Lord Percival Winters and Harold Winters became the scandal of the season. The evidence presented was overwhelming and damning. The letters detailing their conspiracy to force the marriage and seize Lydia's inheritance. Testimony from other families Winters had defrauded through similar schemes. The witnesses to Lydia's kidnapping, including several respectable citizens who had seen the entire abduction. The verdict was never in doubt. Both men were sentenced to lengthy imprisonment, their reputations destroyed, their social positions obliterated. The court ordered their properties seized to compensate their victims, with the Westfall family receiving enough to clear all debts and restore modest financial stability. The Viscount's health, freed from the crushing anxiety of impending ruin, began slowly to improve. Sebastian arranged for the finest physicians to attend him and provided discreet financial guidance that helped the family rebuild their fortune on sounder foundations. It was charity, but presented with such tact that the Viscount's pride remained intact. On September 15th, Lydia celebrated her 27th birthday and officially inherited her grandmother's bequest. £4,000, properly invested, would provide comfortable independence for the rest of her life. The knowledge that she possessed her own resources, that she was choosing Sebastian from genuine affection rather than financial necessity, mattered enormously to both of them. In October, on a perfect autumn afternoon in Greymont's gardens, Sebastian formally proposed. "I love you," he said, kneeling on the leaf-strewn path with a ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "I love your intelligence, your strength, your unwillingness to compromise your principles, even in the face of impossible pressure. I love the way you argue political theory and the way you laugh when you think no one is listening. I love every part of you, Lydia Westfall, and I would be honoured beyond measure if you would consent to be my wife." Lydia looked down at him, this powerful man on his knees before her, and felt tears prick her eyes. "On one condition," she said, and watched uncertainty flash across his features. "That our marriage is a true partnership, that you value my opinions and consult me on matters that affect our lives, that you see me as your equal rather than your dependent." Relief and joy transformed Sebastian's face. "I would have it no other way. You are my equal in every way that matters, Lydia, and I promise to spend the rest of our lives proving that I understand and honour that truth." "Then yes," she said, pulling him to his feet so she could kiss him properly for the first time. "Yes, I will marry you." The wedding took place in November at the Greymont Estate Chapel, a small but perfect ceremony attended by close friends and family. The Viscount, looking healthier than he had in years, walked his daughter down the aisle with pride shining in his eyes. Lady Westfall wept openly, though whether from joy or relief or both remained unclear. And Molly, the loyal maid who had run bleeding through London's streets to fetch help, stood as one of Lydia's witnesses, wearing a new dress and holding her head high with earned dignity. The reception that followed was warm and filled with genuine happiness rather than the calculating social manoeuvring that characterized so many aristocratic weddings. Sebastian's friends toasted the bride's intelligence and courage. Lydia's family toasted the groom's generosity and honour, and everyone present understood that they were witnessing something rare, a marriage built on mutual respect and genuine affection. In the months that followed, Lydia used a significant portion of her inheritance to establish a charitable fund dedicated to helping women escape forced marriages or other forms of coercion. She worked with solicitors to identify women in situations similar to what she had faced and provided them with resources, legal assistance, and safe housing until they could establish independence. Sebastian not only supported this project, but contributed his own resources and influence. Together, they helped dozens of women escape circumstances that would have destroyed them, transforming Lydia's trauma into purpose and her suffering into salvation for others. On their first anniversary, Sebastian found Lydia in the library at Greymont, surrounded by correspondence from women whose lives had been changed by their charitable work. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Any regrets?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Not a single one," Lydia replied, leaning back into his embrace. Though I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been at that ball, hadn't saved my dress from champagne, hadn't cared enough to investigate my family's situation. I would have found another way to meet you, Sebastian said with certainty. Fate doesn't work that hard to bring two people together only to let them slip away through inattention. Lydia turned in his arms to face him. You believe in fate. I believe in us, he corrected. Everything else is just details. And in that moment, surrounded by books and bathed in afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows, Lydia understood that she had found something she had never dared hope for. Not rescue, not obligation, but genuine partnership with a man who valued her mind as much as her heart. The road from desperation to happiness had been harrowing, marked by betrayal and violence and fear. But it had led her here, to this place, to this man, to this life they were building together. And that made every terrifying moment worth enduring. May you find such partnership in your own life. May you have the courage to jump when someone trustworthy extends their hand. And may you always remember that true strength lies not in never falling, but in choosing who you trust to catch you.